Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third session of the Western Cover Crops Council Intermountain Regional Subconference. I'd like to welcome everybody back. Our next presentation this afternoon is building a regenerative agriculture economy through regenerative agriculture validation tools. Our presenter is Nick Honegger, who serves as the general manager of PastureMap. He also serves as an associate at Soilworks Natural Capital.
Well, thanks again for having me. My name is Nick Honegger. I serve as the GM of PastureMap, and I'm an associate over at Soilworks Natural Capital, which is a relatively new regenerative agriculture-focused fund. We're based out of San Antonio, Texas, and I thought the best way to go about talking about how to build a regenerative agriculture economy through regen agriculture validation tools is to actually tell the story of how Soilworks acquired our first validation tool, which was PastureMap. Talk about why we invested in that and some of the kind of future investments in that technology and how that's going to help kind of shape the ecosystem of overall regenerative validation. So with that, let's first talk about Soilworks. So our mission is to accelerate the transition of regenerative agriculture. And there's a lot of similar funds out there that are all focused on this idea of actually pushing regen forward. So what that means for us is we break it down into a couple of categories. One is the farmer itself, consumers, and also consumer brands. I think the one kind of key area of focus that I'll talk on quite a bit through my kind of discussion of Soilworks and our fund is there's a lot of investment happening right now at the rancher level, where it's either incentives through things like the carbon market or ways to kind of change the supply chain through processing plants. But one thing that we're trying to do, and also kind of encourage ranchers to do as well, is look at the end consumer, where if we can't generate the demand and drive that kind of education on why people should pursue regenerative, it's not going to kind of overall create that movement, right? If someone wants to buy regenerative products, it's going to kind of make that very short-sighted in the sense that you have to convince consumers to also take that leap of faith. So that's kind of how our portfolio functions, and our goal is that by all of those things together, we can accelerate the transition to regenerative agriculture by creating consumer demand for it and building a supply chain to also fulfill that demand. And then part of fulfilling that demand is actually proving and validating regenerative itself. So this is kind of an infographic that we use to kind of showcase our focus and what we think you have to do in order to truly invest in a regenerative economy, right? It's broken down into those three core pieces where it's new tools and software, it's supply chains, and also consumer brands. So the principles that we operate under is everything has to be kind of driven toward better and healthier food. It's got to restore plant and animal diversity. It has to regenerate the soil to store water and carbon. And the end goal is more profitable family farms. I think one of the key pieces when, at least for us, when we're looking at how are we growing the regenerative economy, it can't be focused on, you know, great, we got some technology companies to make a ton of money or some carbon markets really took off if the ranchers don't actually get rewarded from it. I think that's the key piece of that movement is we have to ensure the ranchers who are actually making these changes get rewarded for those so they can be sustainable. So kind of the leading indicator of success for everything we look at and a lot of the kind of validation tools is the actual number of regenerative acres that we can help create as an organization, and anything we invest in has that same kind of mindset. So that's a super, super high level kind of overview of why PastureMap came to be. I thought that would provide some basic context, and now we'll get into the fun side, which is the actual validation piece, and spend a little bit more time here. I think PastureMap will be a lot more interesting just because it is for ranchers, kind of by ranchers. So the focus of this is how do we create a standard for rotational and regenerative grazing? Because there's a lot of kind of debate within both our internal team and also kind of around the world of what does it actually mean to be regenerative, and can you kind of assign values to that? So our goal is to invest in a technology that we think can help kind of validate the efforts of ranchers around the globe. So quick overview of PastureMap is the thought process behind it is their current system is broken. I'm sure a lot of folks on the call who are kind of interested and excited about regenerative have seen these numbers before, but the idea is small ranchers are at risk of going extinct in terms of just a massive amount of increase in bankruptcies. There's a crowded and stressed cattle market, and there's lower quality meat being produced. Ranchers are getting dependent on subsidies and just kind of other very expensive ways to augment their production. And there's a concentration of manure and feedlots that are just overall not the best for the planet. So we recognize, and there's a lot of folks that say, hey, we know our system is broken now, but if we're going to make those changes, how do we go about that? I think there's a lot of talk in the industry around like why regenerative and rotational practices are better and how they have certain improvements, but there's not necessarily a guide or a first step of, okay, great, you've been doing it this way for 100 years or more in some cases, depending on where the ranch is located. How do I make that first step to go towards regenerative, right? So we see rotational grazing as a key and the solution to this. I'm going to skip through this slide quickly because I'm sure most folks on the call recognize why rotational is different, but the goal and the core of what rotational means is you're moving or rotating your livestock to different pastures and paddocks every set number of days. So it's a lot more kind of difficult than your traditional conventional ranching, if you will, but it has a robust list of benefits in terms of both food quality, quality of land, and of creating carbon credits. So just overall a great, process to have. The downside of this is that grazing management is a critical piece to rotational grazing, but it is extremely difficult. And we see this time and time again with ranchers who engage both PastureMap or engagements we have at the fund, is that we were trying to grow this regenerative economy, kind of validate it out. And we'll say, okay, what's your grazing plan? Can we showcase what you're doing? And a lot of folks have massive binders or whiteboards all across their offices. Here's our plans, and it's crossed out 1,000 times because it may rain one day, and that changes your grazing plan, or it may you might split your paddock differently, or the grass isn't growing back as fast. And there's all these different variables that I think get very oversimplified when folks say, hey, let's go move to regenerative, and they don't realize just the mass amount of work that's so critical to rotational grazing. So our kind of mindset and how we approach this as a validation tool is not only do you have to validate the practices, you have to, in some sense, make at least the management part of it significantly easier on the rancher, because you can't just say, have all these extremely robust records, and anytime any kind of weather variable changes, at some point it's not going to get updated. There's just too much going on. So that's, I think, the first key piece of validation is how do you make the management tool itself just happen easier, right? So that's the goal of PastureMap, is you validate through very easy kind of grazing management record keeping. And there's a lot of other kind of awesome tools out there. I'm going to use PastureMap as kind of my core example with some of the screenshots, but FarmOS from OpenTeam and MyGrazing also have kind of grazing management tools. By no means do I want you to think I'm pitching our tool particular here, but I think that's what, just from an investment standpoint and an economy building standpoint, that's what you want to look at, is how do you actually drive towards simplified record keeping, and keep that in mind as you're seeing tools and say, okay, step one for validation is actually showing what's happened, where has cattle moved, how has it changed my land, to drive those kind of ecosystem changes. So I think that the way you do that is you find technologies that track things like rest days, animal days per acre, grazing days, forage capacity, ranch infrastructure, and all those key variables that will kind of do two things. One, it will show what ranchers have been doing and where the animals have been. And two, it will validate the changes in the land. So I think a lot of folks now, with the carbon markets being so robust and all the great information we just heard from the prior talk, that is one piece of it, right? It's has the land sequestered more carbon, but the other piece of it is you should be able to see benefits as a rancher in terms of you're getting more from your land. The grass should be healthier. Your forage capacity should increase. So what we found is by investing in tools that simply put a layer of data on top of that to show and augment what you've been up to, that reinforces what you're doing. So you can prove to folks, no, not only do I know my beef is better quality, I can show you how I've improved my land over time through historical changes in my forage capacity, or I could graze this land harder, and I can back that up with data. And I think that's the critical piece here, is being able to show a historical record of how your land has improved over time and time, or season and season. So another thing that we think is super important in terms of kind of validation of regenerative efforts is kind of showing and managing future and historical moves or forecasting data. So again, this can be done in a variety of different platforms. I'm showing the PastureMap example of this just because it's who I work with. But the goal is for current record keeping and planning. What we found from a lot of ranchers is it gets difficult to show, okay, what piece of land are my cattle going to go graze on? What are the impacts of that? So what we are looking for in terms of what we're trying to validate that is, can you forecast that out and then predict how it will impact your land? And obviously, if you pull in rain data and prior history, it's not perfect or 100% accurate all the time, but it gives you that ability to say, okay, here's at least what my set plan was, here's what happened, and then here's my future moves and what my land should produce. And it lets you make just smarter decisions as a rancher to then, okay, well, if my predictions are correct, then I can go get, 100 more head of cattle to run on this land, right? And obviously I'm making up numbers here, but we get stories all the time. And I think one of my kind of metrics of success to say, okay, how do we really know we're validating the efforts of regenerative ranchers and kind of encouraging them to invest in that opportunity is we'll have folks that use forecasting tools based off of that historical, they look at their prior season, they take all those data reports that we provide and say, okay, based off of this, if I can graze my land a little bit harder and hit this, paddock maybe a little more, it'll grow back just based off rainfall data I've got. It will, they'll save 60,000 to 100,000 in food cost. And granted, those are the big numbers that we love to hear, but that's not obviously every single time. But those are the stories I think that get us most excited. And I think the point I'm trying to make here is a lot of this data can be captured now from ranchers. So if you say, I'm sure a lot of folks on the call even are saying, look, I've got a bunch of historical records. I could probably pull weather records too. And I think the goal of technologies when it comes to validation isn't to replace rancher decision-making at all, right? It's to say, look, you already have 1,000 things to worry about on a day-to-day basis. So can we pull all that data for you to validate your efforts kind of in a quicker and kind of data-backed way, where it's rather than you having to go check rainfall gauges and see where your herds were, can we pull all that data for you? So all you have to focus on is getting your cows to move around, which is way harder said than done anywho. And then all the data side of that to prove what you've been moving and prove the impacts to your land is done for you. All right, so here's how that looks from a record keeping standpoint, right? We want ranchers to kind of validate their land through. It shows acres, perimeter, grazable acres, what on your land can actually be grazed, what was grazed this season. And this all goes back to, let's say you're going to go, be it sell your property or make estimates for next year. You can take records and say, okay, here's how I validate my efforts. I have seen what's grazable. I know how much grazable land comes out of this. It pulls in things like NRCS estimates to layer on top of that. And that, in my mind, and in the fund's mind, is really the future in terms of growing the regenerative economy. Is you invest in tools that say, it's not just what the rancher is doing, it's can you incorporate, what does NRCS suggest? What does the NOAA satellite data say on what this land should produce? So that way, the rancher A is creating the most amount of kind of profit if they can per acre. And they've got the data to back up their choices. So if they're going to go to the bank to get a loan or kind of make insurance claims or what have you, they can say, look, I've got detailed records per pasture that show what I've been doing and can produce on my land to help kind of augment any of the, I'd say, the scary side of switching to regenerative. Because a lot of times what we find is folks lose, if they lose a certain type of insurance that they've got because they're switching to farming practices, we want them to be able to be backed up by data. Say, no, here's why it's better, I can prove it. And that's the key, because if they can't finance it, then it's not going to be sustainable long-term. And then the other thing we think is super critical to kind of validating from an investment side is actual old school photos of, how has pasture health changed over time. So there's a couple really cool tools out there that do anything from augment this with satellite data to photos just from your phone. So I threw in some kind of a variety of examples here, but This is only going to get more advanced in terms of a validation standpoint. I've got another slide coming up that shows how satellite imagery is really changing this, but you'd be surprised on how much you can get from just having imagery tied to cattle movements, right? So you can say, hey, if I've had X head of herd for X amount of days, after 20 rest days, what does that grass look like? And how can I prove that? And it's all about, okay, I can take those photos now and validate based off my moves. So when I go to my planning for next season, or if I want to kind of forecast other seasons out, I can see historically how that grass performs. And then again, it all comes back to how you tie that back to other sources of data. So is it because you had extra rainfall? Were you in drought? So the trick for validation is just having that all in one place. The other thing too that is super critical, and this is kind of what I alluded to earlier in the presentation, is kind of generating grazing records, right? Where it shouldn't be a super tedious process for ranchers to have to edit and kind of change their movements constantly. So the goal for true validation in my kind of mind is you should be able to set your grazing plan. And then based off of all of the kind of data you've got in animal health, you can easily audit and view your historical and current grazing plans and the impact that has had on your overall production in terms of acres and kind of animal weights and AUD changes. And that, at the end of the day, right, if you have all your records in one spot, you kind of export this report of, okay, here's everything I did this season. Here's all of the rain. Here's all of the grass changes, forage changes, animal weight changes. I can show you exactly where my cattle went over time. And then that, in my mind, is truly validated regenerative, right? You've got from where this cap started to where it ended, every single move it's made. You've got every piece of weather data tied to that. You've got soil data changes tied to that, and it's all mapped in one spot and all on one recorded report. And that is how, in my mind, as you get all of that data captured in one place, you can truly be a validated kind of source of regenerative, right? So kind of to summarize that, it's kind of our end goal as both a fund and a company, and there's a whole bunch of other folks doing similar stuff that we're working with on Open Team that are kind of in the same mindset, right? Is to truly validate your efforts. You need historical data for all your herds. You need photos and grazing history saved directly to the pasture. And you need rest history automatically calculated and visualized to ensure soil health. And then the stuff we're super excited about from an investment standpoint, and also just that's coming down the pipeline, is satellite imagery and having a lot more soil data tied back to pastures. So the downside of some of the stuff right now, especially with soil test data, capturing things like bulk density changes and doing combustion testing, it's relatively expensive and extremely expensive depending on the size of your operation. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here and saying soil tests can get kind of out of hand and expensive, right? Everybody wished they could do soil tests, but if you could do them at the click of a button, we're spending days and days on end kind of going out and digging trenches. Sure, it's way easier said than done. So the things that we're excited about from a validation standpoint, and then I think that's coming down the pipeline that's going to be really exciting, is that folks are using kind of LiDAR, which is a type of satellite technology, and a few other satellite technologies to say, look, we can see the bulk density changes over time in certain parts of your land, right? They scan your ranch essentially and spit out this little kind of satellite image I have here in the top right, and they can tell you, hey, we're 80% sure that here is the kind of carbon change in your soil over the past year of grazing. And you tie that to your grazing records to make sure, okay, well, I moved my cattle around or my animals around, so that seems to make sense. And say, okay, well, if you did all of that, you should be able to go take these kind of 8 soil samples. And I'm making up numbers here, but let's say you normally do 50. The goal is, well, what if you could do 10 leveraging satellite data and still get the same kind of validated efforts where you can prove how much carbon you sequestered, but it's way more cost effective. And a lot of this technology is emerging now. There's a really cool group in Australia right now called Farm Labs that's doing something relatively similar to this. Their end goal, which I think is super exciting, is to avoid testing entirely. I think that's a lofty kind of crazy goal, but if they can achieve it, like that would be phenomenal from a ranching standpoint, because instead of having to go test the stuff yourself, you just kind of scan and forget, if you will. But the goal here, and how this all ties back to validation, is you can have as many kind of animal records and grazing plans as you want. And you can kind of show where, be it cattle or whatever you're grazing, has moved over time and the impact it has had on the land. But we haven't found a way as of yet to get around the soil test at the end of the day. Like that's the true kind of meat and potatoes, if you will, to validate, okay, you've got the records, you've shown where stuff is moved, we've got the science behind it to say it should be doing stuff that's better for the soil, it should be capturing more water, it should sequester carbon, but how do you truly prove that? So what we've been doing is working with folks at Open Team and a few other organizations to say, okay, if we can take all of your records and then do the soil testing aspects to that, that's how we can say this is truly a source of validation, right? It's soil data plus herd data kind of layered onto one. And that's what I think, in terms of be it investment or what we see as validation tool sets, is that ultimate combo, if you will. So what's next for, I think, kind of validation as a whole, and kind of what we're looking at from, if I were to, investments and what have you in the kind of regenerative ecosystem and validation kind of space. So I would say PastureMap certified here, but I think it's this goal of how do you certify something as rotational or regenerative? And we're working with a few groups now that are trying to put kind of a regenerative label, be it on their beef or what have you. And what we found is kind of interesting in that there's a lot of debate on what it actually means to be anything from rotational to regenerative, and even if those are swappable terms, and some say they're not, and kind of what the difference is. So I think what we'll see kind of emerge in the marketplace over the next year or so, as this becomes a lot more just relevant because of carbon market developments and relevant because of consumer demands for higher quality products, is a lot more clear guidelines around what does it mean to have a regenerative operation. There's some kind of big folks with Cargill's doing this now. Applegate is running some experiments now. There's a million other ranchers too, and some kind of big kind of nonprofit organizations that are trying to kind of build standards around this. So our theory behind it all is that regardless of who kind of wins the race to the first certificate, it's all going to come back to rancher data and record keeping, right? It's can we start with, hey, I moved my cattle this many times, had this many rest days, and here's the impact to my land. And every certificate that we've seen kind of in beta and everyone we've talked to so far, it goes back to that data. So even if you're thinking to yourself, what are my first steps to either be regenerative, or if I really want to kind of dive into that ecosystem and maybe take advantage of the carbon credits markets, how do I get started? Be it a technological tool like PastureMap or FarmOS or what have you, or just the savory kind of record keeping printout, the PDF, I'm sure you all can imagine, where you're just filling that information out and detailed record keeping. That is honestly the key first step for every single standard I've seen, is just, can you show where your cattle have moved over the past couple of years and what the impact to your land has been because of that, right? And then the other things coming are scalable region and carbon validation through satellite imagery. I already chatted about that, but I just cannot emphasize enough how much I think that's going to kind of impact the industry in a world where there are kind of tests going on now that showed it could be as soon as a year to 2 years from now. I don't want to say soil tests will be a thing of the past, but significantly reduced costs, significantly reduced time because you're doing less of them. And that's the kind of the second piece of validation, right? Is hey, I've got my movements. I know where stuff should be better and better sequestered. So now I can be it do a snapshot from the sky or do significantly fewer tests to get that to say, no, I can show you how much more carbon is in my soil. Other things that kind of are on the horizon that I think will be kind of interesting to see in the future are kind of more robust animal inventory functionality and kind of smart tools, if you will, or the IoT or Internet of Things of ranching tools. So there's a lot of these out here, but just for the sake of an example, like Fence.io is a virtual fencing company, or Smart Collars. But the whole concept is, ranchers know and have it documented, right? They have grazing management plans where cattle should be moving. But what you typically have to do now is go paddock to paddock and say, you're not counting every single cattle, granted, depending on the size of your operation, but you're getting at least a sense of, okay, I've got, X amount of head in paddock 86 for the day. And you have to go send yourself or a ranch hand out to go confirm that and make sure they move and open the gate. Or even if you're on smart gates, you're still checking to see stuff is moving in between them. And I think the next piece of validation is all just augmenting the data collection you're already doing, right? So it's smart tags that are kind of showing where your cattle are at all times. So you don't have to be the one to go out there and actually see where the herds are. It's gates that when cattle cross through, it alerts you, right? It says they've already moved over. So I think we're seeing a ton of folks with really cool and exciting technologies that we're kind of partnering with out of Open Team or integrating them into PastureMap. But the core is kind of the way we've seen it and the way we see this industry evolve is ranchers right now have like 100 data points, probably more, that they're trying to track every single day to kind of validate that they're doing regenerative practices. And some of it's because they want to be regenerative and kind of take advantage of emerging environmental service markets and kind of really invest their time into that. And on the other half of it, it's just in order to be a great regenerative rancher or rotational rancher, you have to know a lot of this stuff anyway, right? You have to know your grazing plan. You have to know how many cattle are in your paddocks at any one time. You have to know your rest days. So the trick and how I really think this market's going to evolve and what you should be kind of investing your time in aren't tools that tell you what to do, right? It's not that you don't know how to run your ranch. It's you have to collect a lot of information right now on a whole bunch of variables. So wouldn't it be nicer if you could focus on the ranching aspect because you know the best practices, right? But it's a whole lot of work to log all of that and track all of that in one spot. So the tools that I think are really going to be kind of cause the forefront of validation and allow you to be environmental kind of service markets and carbon credit markets and all these other kind of core benefits that come out of regenerative agriculture that people are talking about is by doing what you're already doing and finding tools that capture that and log it for you and let you say, no, I know what I'm doing is right. Here's the data to validate it. And it does it for you, right? As stuff moves through, there's smart tags that auto upload animal information. There's GPS tags that are getting developed. There's stuff that will pull in your rain data. There's stuff that logs your forage levels. And it's a lot of the stuff that you're already kind of tracking in the back of your mind, where you kind of have an idea of how many rest days you should have. So the trick is, okay, now that you've got the hypothesis of what you think is the best, run it through this tool that can crunch the data for you and say, you know what, I could probably graze an extra day or two here, and here's the impact to my ROI, right? Which is like what if you go see like a ranching for profit course or a lot of the folks in the industry, that a lot of the debate isn't about best practices when it comes to validation. It's, how do you squeeze the most out of your land? And I think that's all through, and a lot of the tools we're looking at that are super exciting. It's not through telling you how to do it better or telling you best practices. It's, hey, you're already doing the hard part. Here's the data behind it so you can start trying new things and hypothesize on how you can maybe get more from your land. So with that being said, I think that in my world, and I hope that gave a cool example of why we chose PastureMap as our kind of first investment and kind of some examples of where we think the future of validation is for regenerative agriculture. In summary, I would say it's very exciting to be in this space. I think it's really turned into, there's a whole bunch of data points that ranchers are collecting now, and it's going to be awesome to see how we can empower them to get all those data points in one place and kind of leverage the power of technology and get it off of the old Excel sheets and into something a little bit more powerful and let them leverage that data themselves to make those better decisions. And once they've got that, they can say, look, I've validated my efforts because I know regenerative best practices, and I've got the data to showcase why I'm using it the best way. But no, thanks again for letting me chat with you all today, and happy to answer any questions or dive more into what we've seen in the space or other kind of cool technologies we've seen being developed.